Excited to welcome everyone here in the Farley Auditorium and those of you joining us online from our YouTube and Facebook channels. Before we begin today's program, I have just a few quick announcements. The first is that on Monday, October 6th, Research Rundown will return with a local archive spotlight on the Montgomery County Archives. If you're interested in this program, it is a virtual-only program on our Facebook and YouTube channels, and it'll be October 6th at noon. So I hope to see you there virtually. And then next month, I want to go ahead and invite you back to our next Food for Thought. It'll be on Thursday, October 16th, as Katie Lamar Jackson will present A Tiger Among Us, the Benny Adkins story. That will be at noon here in the Farley Auditorium, as well as streaming live on our YouTube and Facebook channels. I'd like to say a quick thank you to the Friends of the Alabama Archives for sponsoring our Food for Thought, and for the Alabama Humanities Alliance for providing a grant that makes it possible. Now on to today's speaker. I am excited to introduce you to Warren Rogers. Warren Rogers is a professor emeritus of history at the University of North Georgia. He's the author of numerous works on the Civil War and Reconstruction, including this one right here, The Battle for the University of Alabama, The Perilous Path of Higher Education in the Reconstruction South, which is available for purchase in our lobby. And he'll be talking more about that today. Since retiring in 2023, Rogers has continued to research and write from his home in Auburn. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogers.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for coming today. For me, this is really a nice homecoming because I've been coming here a long time. My father was a historian, and he grew up in Greenville and went to Auburn and then the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and spent his career teaching at Florida State University. But he really never left Alabama. That was his first and last love. And he wrote a lot about the state. And anyway, he is responsible really for me coming here the first time. In the late 1960s, I tagged along as a little boy, and he came and did his research. And that was back in the day. Some of you may know of Milo Howard, who's pretty famous for good reason. And then I went to graduate school and liked history a lot and became a historian, and inherited a great feel for Alabama, and have spent my career mostly writing about it. Alex said that I wrote about the Civil War, and I have a little bit, a book on Montgomery during the war, but really my focus is Reconstruction, and that's what the book I'm going to talk about today is about. So I've been coming here as a historian, as a researcher for a long time, since the 1980s, and this is the first trip, though, as a speaker, so I'm real honored, very much so, to do that. I've got some pictures I hope you'll like that I'll show you at the end of the presentation and such. But one thing that, I want to say in recognition of the archives is a lot of Alabamians and maybe Montgomeryans don't really know what we have here. This is not only the first state archives in the country, it's easily the best in the South today. Look around you. This is a wonderful room. This is a beautiful building. It is that. So aesthetically, it's really something. But even more importantly, it's this. We have the best holdings. We have just incredible holdings, manuscript collections, newspapers. It's just unbelievable. The staff here is really, really good, has been and is very much that. And so, this is a special, special building. Some of you may know Steve Murray, who just walked in there. And I say to Steve sometimes when I see him that I've never seen a place that is so alive with all dead people's records in it. And it very much is, because they make an effort to reach out to the community, to the state, and it's just a really special place. Okay. Maybe you could say that I just fell into this topic as a subject for a book. About 10 years ago, I was in this building doing research on a general study of Reconstruction in Alabama, and I kept running into turmoil at the University of Alabama that was taking place in the late 1860s. It seemed that the state university was at the center of a political controversy that divided Alabama Republicans and Alabama Democrats. There was something of a power struggle going on for control of the school. I looked at various books to see if anybody else had really covered the episode, and it didn't seem that nobody had. At first, as I went about my research, it seemed that maybe this would be a nice subject for an article to be published in a professional journal like the Alabama Review. But then as I got into it a little more, it really seemed to me that this had the potential to turn into a book. And that's the way, in fact, it did work out. And so I'd say this to you this afternoon, and that is that so often the time you discover your next topic while you're working on something else, you discover it accidentally, you fall into it, and it's a neat thing, and that's how a lot of historians get their topics. Anyway, let me provide a little background and set the stage for the chaos at the University of Alabama, because turmoil is what the book is about. First, in at least one way, Alabama was fortunate during the Civil War. The state was largely spared much of the kind of destruction that other southern states experienced. But there were exceptions, and the University of Alabama provides one of those exceptions. The school was the only state university in the entire Confederate States of America to have been destroyed. On April the 4th, 1865, troops under General John Croxton burned the university. We might wonder why soldiers would put to the torch a place that is identified with books and thinking and a serene tree-shaded campus. Well, here's a reason. Alabama's legislature in 1859 had turned the university into a military school, and during the conflict, Confederate soldiers were trained on the campus. That fact made it a military target. Today, in 2025, the very finite number of buildings that exist on the University of Alabama that were spared that day are in a very special kind of revered class. There are about 5 of them. Okay, very few other Southern universities suffered physical damage during the war, but the conflict did adversely affect these schools. My study looks only at state universities during Reconstruction and not private colleges. Not every Confederate state even had a state university during the Civil War. These states did not. Florida, Arkansas, and Texas. Almost all state universities in the South closed during the Civil War. Alabama would be the last to reopen. The future home of the Alabama Crimson Tide did not do so until 1869. So here's a way for all of us today to think about how late 1869 was. Some Confederate veterans had started their, in fact, education and finished it by the time the University of Alabama got around to, in fact, opening in 1869. But in that year, we're ready to resume educating. By then, a brick 4-story structure has been built, and the proud University of Alabama would be resurrected. Today, that building is known as Woods Hall. Things seem to be trending in the right direction. It's 1869, we're about to reopen. However, there are major problems, and the difficulties that followed for several years are the focus of the battle for the University of Alabama, the perilous path of higher education in the Reconstruction South. By the way, the university is still a military school in the 1860s and 1870s. All the students are white. All the students are, in fact, male. All the students are really more appropriately called cadets. They drill, that kind of a thing, and that's the way things are. We need a little more background to put what took place at Tuscaloosa in perspective. This was the era of Reconstruction, as you know, and for the first time, the Republican Party in Alabama totally controlled state government. I would ask you to consider this. The Reconstruction period is possibly the most bitter political period in American history. The questions that dominated national and state and local politics have a great deal to do with the constitutional rights of the former slaves. The politics of Reconstruction was framed by race. Reconstruction issues were often cultural in nature. Many white Southerners saw it this way. Republicans had made a terrible mistake by giving illiterate former slaves the right to vote. There was a long grocery list of alleged transgressions that raised new passions or raw passions among whites. These circumstances justified, in terms of politics, violence for some, and the anti-Republican Ku Klux Klan was born. Politics had never been so personal. Here's how one individual living at the time explained feelings. This person was an Alabamian, and he was comparing political disagreements before the war to political disagreements after the conflict. And this is what he said. Whigs and Democrats used to abuse each other very fiercely in speeches and newspapers, but such things scarcely ever affected our social relations. He added, I noticed what I never noticed before, that the estimate of a man is more controlled by his politics than by anything else. It was in the middle of this bitter age of Reconstruction that the University of Alabama reopened. We have a new building. It is a very fine one. What's next is appointing professors and a president. This is where the explosive battle really starts. The Board of Regents of the state makes these hiring decisions. In 1868, the board was composed entirely of Republicans. In the summer of 1868, the regents appointed a president, 5 professors, and a commandant. In the past, appointments for the University of Alabama had been made pretty much on the basis of merit. According to Democrats, the Republicans on the Board of Regents had broken an unwritten rule by choosing fellow Republicans. The storyline, the narrative that dominated went this way after the hiring and appointment of these professors and so forth. Here's the storyline. Republicans had put in place a partisan faculty and a partisan president and politicized the state university, and the story got worse. Critics maintained that the professors were absolutely unqualified to teach on a university level. Now, I should stop here and say that the criticisms are exaggerated. All the professors, for one, were not Republicans. They were not necessarily unqualified to teach. The criticisms really were oversimplified, but there was some truth to them. What mattered, though, was, here's the crucial word, what mattered was perception. And the perception was that Republican politicians, for crass political motives, were hijacking the state university. Here is the opinion of a newspaper known as the Montgomery Mail. It reacts this way. The university as well close its doors. No gentleman will send his sons to be educated by knaves and fools. Many Alabamians agreed with that sentiment. Democrats were willing to believe the very worst of Republicans in Reconstruction, Alabama, and what had happened at the state university provided grist for the mill. In the late 1860s, about 2,500 people lived in, really it's not a city, Tuscaloosa. The large majority of whites were Democrats. Among them, passions ran high. Some of the bitterest of them joined the local Ku Klux Klan, and in the name of white supremacy, they beat Republicans and worse. The most outspoken enemy of the party of Abraham Lincoln was a man named Ryland Randolph. He despised everything the Republican Party stood for. Randolph, as an individual, was very volatile. He had a quick temper. He was a leading figure in the local Klan. And Randolph, worse, had a forum to spread his ideas because he edited this newspaper, the Tuscaloosa Independent Monitor. You can imagine what he thought of the reincarnated U of A under the Republican direction. Here are some of the typical statements that appeared on the pages of the newspaper. Randolph described the faculty as, quote, carpetbag vultures. More specifically, he referred to the, quote, vile carcass of the professor of natural philosophy. Randolph described the professor of ancient languages as, quote, repulsive looking and a man whose appearance would scare children. Randolph spared almost nobody. He branded the professor of history an ignoramus, an upstart, a drunkard, and a fool for staying in Tuscaloosa. What we should say then is the rebirth of the University of Alabama in 1868, 1869 took place in a setting and environment that can be described as a hotbed of political extremism. Under ordinary circumstances, the reopening of the university should have been a time of just joyous celebration in the town of Tuscaloosa. Number one, being the home of the state university was prestigious, and Tuscaloosa was a place that knew about losing prestige. She had been the state capital from 1826 to 1847, when the capital was moved, of course, to Montgomery. So we can say the prestige of serving as the university site is now restored. Number two, another reason to celebrate. The school's location in Tuscaloosa provided a big shot in the arm to the local economy. Students and family came and went and spent money. Number three, Alabamians would no longer have to pursue higher education outside of the state of Alabama, the University of Virginia, the University of Georgia, what have you. They could stay home. And then number four, just this. Opening the school would finally lay to rest the ghost of Union cavalry who on that terrible day in April 1865 destroyed the school. So if we think about it today, we can ask, what's not to like about a reborn University of Alabama? In the thinking of an Alabama Reconstruction Democrat, there's a lot not to like. Good-for-nothing Republicans have appointed ignorant carpetbaggers and scalawags to masquerade as professors and desecrate a proud institution known as the University of Alabama. The period that provides the focus of the book is between 1868 and 1871. There are not many cadets attending. In 1869, as we kick off, there are maybe 50 students who move their belongings into the really fine fortress-looking building that had been built to accommodate 250 cadets. I would ask you to consider this too. A very small percentage of Alabamians in the 19th century ever attended a university. Very few gained a higher education. Most of those who did were from affluent families. They were the sons of planners and people with money. Most of those were Democratic families. That fact spelled real trouble for the university. The vast majority of Democrats refused to send their sons to what was demonized as a radical Republican university. That was a repudiation of the school from the Tennessee Valley to Mobile and all points in between. In the past, Attending the University of Alabama had been a point of honor. In the present, enrolling there was absolutely dishonorable. You could say that the university had an image problem. Between 1869 and 1871, the number of students never reached 60 at one time, and it continued to fall. In 1871, at its lowest watermark, there were fewer than 10 cadets studying there. The lack of students and the continued attrition would eventually force change. There were other difficulties. The school had much trouble finding a president. The first president appointed by the Board of Regents was a man named Arid Lakin. His credentials as a Republican made President Lakin highly suspect. Lakin had moved to Huntsville from the North after the war, and although a minister, he took an active role in the Republican Party. The Huntsville Times accused Lakin of, quote, preaching politics to the Negroes ever since he squatted in Alabama. His political status largely accounted for the harsh reception which Lakin received when he first came to Tuscaloosa in September 1868. So he's president-elect, and he comes in September 68 with the superintendent of Board of Education to a place he'd never been before, and that is Tuscaloosa. Local troublemakers hooted and hollered and intimidated. One worried Democrat there that day realized the real danger that Lakin was in and advised him for his safety not to step foot on the campus. Lakin took that advice. The president's visit to Tuscaloosa lasted less than 24 hours. He headed back to Huntsville and promptly resigned the presidency. Now, this is even before the school opened. The Reverend Arid Lakin's first visit to Tuscaloosa was his last. The Board of Regents then convened and turned to another president. Robert Harper is his name. Harper was an Ohio minister. He had come to Alabama, lived here for a year or two. He had been a chaplain, in a Federal Army regiment during the war. Let's just say that the welcome wagon was not rolled out for him either. One not so friendly observer in Tuscaloosa predicted Harper planned to come to the university, quote, with a carpet bag in his hand and a huge desire in his heart for the spoils of office. Even before President Harper had the chance to spend a single night in the president's mansion, disguised Klansmen gathered at the mansion one night in January 1869 to send a message. Okay, you know how you go some places and you're going to go swimming maybe, and the sign says, swim at your own risk. Well, here's the message that our friend President Harper got. Come at your own risk. Come at your own risk. That was the message that the assembled Klansmen absolutely sent. And Harper listened. Harper came around to Arid Lakin's way of thinking. He resigned before a day on the job. All of this took place, and we haven't even held the first day of class. Then there were the professors. They fared no better, maybe worse. The faculty were seen as pariahs. It did not take long for the men stigmatized by the circumstances of their employment to find out just how unpopular they really were. Let's look at several of those. I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but let's look at several of those who local people didn't think belonged on the all-star team. DeForest Richards was 60 years old in 1869, hired to teach natural philosophy and astronomy. He had a Northern background, had voted not once but twice for Abraham Lincoln, and could be described as an abolitionist before the war. Those credentials did not endear him to local Tuscaloosans. Some of Professor Richards' detractors, and he had many, shaved the tail and mane off his horse. Richards enjoyed riding his family about Tuscaloosa in their carriage, And Ryland Randolph, the editor, responded in the Independent Monitor by promising, quote, "A day of reckoning awaits you." Then there was Calvin Loomis. Calvin Loomis was professor of ancient languages. Randolph physically assaulted him in a local bookstore. Finally, there's Vernon Vaughan. Vernon Vaughan taught history. He was ridiculed as a hopeless drunk. A local woman wrote privately, Vaughan, quote, "drinks and gambles. What a teacher." What I'm about to say may first you strike you as wildly irrelevant, but let me explain. The subject today, of course, is the University of Alabama and its trials. But in this state, many people don't ever get too far away from football. And I listened a little bit to what Coach Hugh Freeze said the other day about Auburn University's football prospects this year. He stated that to have a successful season, the Plainsmen or the Tigers would need to A, stay away from injuries, B, play good fundamental football, and C, have the ball bounce their way sometimes. In other words, good fortune or luck is important. The relationship of Coach Free's statement in this book goes this way. In the case of trying to describe the situation at the University of Alabama, I was very lucky. The ball bounced my way. And the best example of that is I found a number of letters that Professor Calvin Loomis had written from Tuscaloosa to his brother, who was an esteemed professor at Yale University. They are today at the Yale University Archives. I looked at them. Calvin Loomis then provided me a front row seat in the first person from the university, and that was invaluable. Sometimes he wrote as if he and his fellow faculty were the outnumbered defenders of a frontier fort rather than professors at a state university. And I used a line from one of Loomis's letters to his brother as the title for chapter 5. And it goes this way. He wrote his brother, "A position with the university is not at present a very pleasant one." That was an understatement. A position with the university is not at present a very pleasant one. What you might call the grand reopening of the school took place on the 5th day of April, 1869. It was anything but grand. The rebirth of the university did not generate excitement and pride. Quite to the contrary, the school would falter and almost fail. Here was the positive. The University of Alabama was open. Here was the negative. Nobody was much attending, and the only attention the school received reflected poorly on it. And that pattern continued. The battle for the University of Alabama has 9 chapters. 7 of those deal with the confrontation at Tuscaloosa, and the other 2 chapters concern the situation at other southern state universities. In order to give some context for what happened at the University of Alabama, I provided accounts of the experience of her sister southern institutions during Reconstruction as they reopened. At some of these universities, there is trouble of a political nature, with Democrats accusing Republicans of playing politics with higher education. There is turmoil, especially at the University of North Carolina and Louisiana State University, and controversy at the University of Mississippi. 2 schools especially escaped that. The University of Virginia and the University of Georgia were spared that trouble, and they hit the ground running in 1865. In the meantime, the University of Alabama stumbled along between 1869 and 1871. The school just failed to shake its stigma as a radical institution. No president emerged to lead the institution forward. The situation was so bad that in late 1869, just months after it had reopened, the Board of Regents decided to move the school to another location in Alabama. I know that the Crimson Tide faithful will be shocked to hear that relocation was contemplated, but the record speaks for itself. The Regents attempted to move the university because the poisonous climate in Tuscaloosa would never allow the university to succeed. Various places put in bids, monetary bids, to take the school. That some places would even put up some money for the wreck of a school, surprised the editor of a Selma newspaper, who was no friend to the Republican Party. As for moving the University of Alabama, he wrote in surprise, "We took it for granted that no town or city would be willing to receive it." The plans of relocating the school never came to anything, of course, but matters only got worse in 1870, 1871. On April the 1st, 1870, a cadet shot Ryland Randolph in broad daylight in downtown Tuscaloosa. The cadet was arrested later that day. So was Vernon Vaughn, the history professor, who was charged as being an accessory to the crime. The apparent attempted murder by the cadet created an explosive situation. Many of the cadets, and there weren't that many to begin with, left immediately in the middle of the term. In the end, Vernon Vaughn was cleared of the charges. The cadet escaped from the jail dramatically, fled Tuscaloosa, and never returned. Ryland Randolph did survive, but the injury caused the amputation of one of his legs. All of this threw the University of Alabama into a worse light, if indeed that was possible. Things got worse before they got better. In the spring of 1871, enemies of the school, in its present form, attempted to run off cadets with Republican or Northern connections. The episode began when a series of threatening letters were sent to these supposed undesirable cadets. The letters were found secured by a dagger to one of the university doors. The anonymous authors signed themselves only this way, KKK. So here's how one letter read: "You nor no other damn son of a damn radical shall stay at the university." Here's another addressed to another cadet that went this way: "We will be out in force in less than 10 days, and it will not be good for you to be found out there." There never was any attack on any of the cadets given notice to leave. And the fact that all of the young men quickly dropped out may have had something to do with that. We can say in conclusion that the first 3 years after the revival of the University of Alabama were a time of a downward spiral. In another day, the reopening of the university would have proceeded smoothly. Yet this was 1869, 1870, not 1884 or 1903, and the political winds were blowing with gale force in Alabama. It was a case of very bad timing. A state-of-the-art building had been raised to bring back the university. The building that you see up there was really, as I said, state-of-the-art for that day. It was lit with gas, it was heated by steam, and the furnishings for students were superior. That did not matter one bit. How was it that the university began to regain its footing and turn around? Democrats by 1871 had gained control of the Board of Regents. They hired a president that was not a Republican. They also appointed a faculty that was politically acceptable. The Republican professors were shown the door. What this all meant was that the University of Alabama had gained what it had lacked in terms of perception. That was the legitimacy in the eyes of the public. It was no longer a so-called radical university run by alleged unqualified and self-proclaimed professors. Men like Loomis were gone. Men like Richards were gone, and so was Vernon Vaughn. Very soon, we have this. We have many more young men drilling and walking the halls of the university building. So in conclusion, I come back to the title of the book, The Battle for the University of Alabama. The victor in the battle for the university was a foregone conclusion. The establishment was going to win, and the insurgents were going to lose. The last paragraph of the book reads partly this way, quote, "The emotions raised by Reconstruction, conflict understood in cultural, ideological, and political terms, knew no precedent and has known none since. What took place at the University of Alabama provided a unique battleground that was revelatory of Reconstruction in the South." Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let me show you a few pictures here, and that's always nice. This is the building, and by the way, a noted architect from Montgomery, George Fye, who built some very fine structures before the Civil War and after in Montgomery, George Fye, he built the building, and it took a while. But anyway, George Fye was the architecture and the construction man. The great loss, and that's true, it was a great loss, the university, and it was burned, about a week before the war ended. So it was a terrible thing. Anyway, that's an artist drawing of it, of course, and it was a beautiful school. The university today in downtown, they just mesh. They're right there together. But really then, the U of A was a mile east of Tuscaloosa, so it was somewhat isolated. And it was right by, which is a building that I'm sure you know, the insane asylum, which had been built during the 1850s. And that. So anyway, the destruction of it was terrible. The buildings were awful pretty. This too. The worst thing maybe was the art and manuscripts and whatnot, really art that was lost, irreplaceable, very much that. You may have heard a story that, there was one book that escaped destruction, and that was the Quran. And somehow or another, there's a story that the Quran was spared because it was the Quran. That's maybe so, but probably not. But this is for sure. There was more than one book that survived, but there weren't many. And really rebuilding the school, those who rebuilt the library went high and low to Mobile and elsewhere to get books to restock the school. I mean, here's an example for you. In 1870, South Carolina's library has 25,000 volumes. We have less than 1,000. So that tells you something. So that was a real loss for sure. This man, Ryland Randolph, let's see, he lived on till almost 1900. And he doesn't have a very good reputation for sure, and he deserves a bad reputation. He lost his leg, and he lived in a lot of pain for the rest of his life, very much that. He was a Civil War soldier. He eventually moved to Birmingham, but I will give him his due. He knew how to put things. He was a very effective newspaper editor. He put things to get people excited and angry, and he had a gift in terms of writing and so forth, for sure that. So Ryland Randolph, a big man for probably all the wrong reasons in Alabama history. Some of you seen this before. This is absolutely iconic. This is out of the Tuscaloosa Independent Monitor, And Ryland Randolph was good at writing, but he had a cartoonist. And the cartoonist did these kinds of political kind of cartoons that said what Randolph wanted to say. And in this case, this is a reaction to Arid Lakin coming to Tuscaloosa in September 1868. And this is the kind of imagined promise that he will, and there's Lakin with the Ohio carpet bag. There's he's going to be hanged. And his friend there is the man who went with him, who has Montgomery connections, Noah Cloud. And he too, that was the promise. And then the KKK mule there and so forth. This was just the most famous political cartoon in the entire Reconstruction period in the entire South. And one of the reasons for that was because it was so outrageous. And another reason for that is because in terms of the North and Republicans in the North, this was just what they wanted, because this depicted, this cartoon, the South as unrepentant, as defiant, as angry, as violent. And this particular cartoon was lifted from the pages of the Tuscaloosa Independent Monitor, and it was reprinted in many, many, many big northern newspaper dailies. And those who have observed the presidential election of 1868, and that's when this appears, have said that a couple of northern states fell into the Republican column just because of this, in fact, cartoon. What I don't have is the print below it. And the print below it is a diatribe by Randolph, and it's Randolph at his worst or Randolph at his best, however you want to see it, think about it, because it's just incredible what he's saying about the Republicans and these two men. And in some ways he was gifted, but he was dangerously gifted, for sure of that. So that picture, what else have we got? Oh, here we go. Here is Calvin Loomis. This is the man who Randolph described as somebody who would scare children, his countenance. I don't really see that. But anyway, Calvin Loomis, he was forced out. He was an educator all his life. But in terms of, say, prestige, teaching at the university was the height of his career, because after that he taught at, nothing wrong with this, but in public schools, in lower Alabama, South Alabama, and, he was never a university professor again, but he was always a man of education. And Calvin Loomis is, somebody like a lot of us, like a lot of Alabamians who just kind of slip through the cracks that we don't know anything about, but in a lot of ways, in so many ways, they're so important and they're so representative of a time and so forth. Now, he's damned and his reputation is drugged through the mud by Randolph and others. He wasn't even a Republican, just that. He really wasn't. I've read his letters and so forth, but that didn't really matter. Now, this man was a Republican and very glad to be one. His name is, DeForest Richards. Now, DeForest Richards, he was a minister in the past and really had spent most of his life behind a pulpit. And he came south and he did, in fact, first drop anchor in Wilcox County around Camden and so forth. And he was appointed in 1868 to, in fact, be on the faculty. And he was the oldest by far of the professors. And in terms of him, too, he was a Republican, proud to be one, an abolitionist, voted for Lincoln, would tell you so in a second. He was a person who didn't back down from anybody, and that included Ryland Randolph and company. And by being so strong and not, in fact, cowering, he was very much most hated. Hated's not the word, loathed, very much that. And he was let go too, and really died pretty soon after that. He was married, had several children, whatnot, had a couple of years at the University of Alabama. Let's see who else we have here. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at these kinds of, here we go. Vernon Vaughn. Oh my gosh. Vernon Vaughn, he's a very, I think, distinguished looking guy. He had problems in his personal life. A lot of what Randolph said was wildly exaggerated and untrue, but he did have a drinking problem. There's no doubt about that. He was out publicly drunk, and no doubt about it, but he was a smart guy. He's from the Montgomery area. He fought for the South during the Civil War. He was a Republican, converted to the Republican Party. He called Montgomery, Alabama home. And in 1869, he joins the faculty. He was married and whatnot, had several children, was a lawyer here for a brief period of time after the war. And he was really something. Vernon Vaughn moved on too. And by the way, he was found innocent. He was an accessory, some said, for the crime that, ended in Randolph being shot. He was innocent of that. But back to the cartoons. This cartoonist makes pokes a lot of fun at the Republicans on the faculty. And this is just one example. There were 6, 8, 10 more. So here he is, you don't recognize him, but that's the same guy I just showed you, Vernon Vaughn. He liked to go hunt quail, and he had some dogs. And so there's a picture of him going out and, going out on the hunt and so forth. And there were other depictions that depicted the Republican professors in a bad kind of a way. But that was part of Randolph's standard operating procedure. Finally, today, well, here is in better times, the University of Alabama, and this is the building. And, again, not many people know what significance the building holds, but, it's really, really something. It's used by the art department today. It's a great building. And it's, one that's seen a lot of history, good times and bad times. Let's see, one more thing I'll tell you. I was really lucky, as I said, to get some sources that I could use. Thing that distressed me the most, or I wish I had a little more of, no real input, no feedback from the cadets themselves. No letters do in fact exist, and if you do in fact purchase a book, and if you do read it, I use some poetic license to maybe put them into the story. I needed to. I'm glad I did, but very little in the way of words written or spoken by the cadets and such. So there you go. Have y'all got any questions? Thank you very much for coming today. Yeah.
If you have some type of questions, if you are joining us online, then you can my phone. But if you're here in person, if you have a question, if you just wait for me to bring the microphone so the online audience knows what your question is. Anyone here have a question? All right, I see your hand. There we go.
The other university towns, some had problems, maybe not as bad as Tuscaloosa, and some didn't. Do you have a theory about what was going on in, say, Charlottesville or Athens, as opposed to Baton Rouge or Tuscaloosa, that would have made that so?
Yeah, that's a real good question. And what you could say is this, that in both Georgia and in Virginia, you did not have Republicans controlling higher education and making, and I'm not saying bad appointments, but making controversial appointments. The University of Georgia and Virginia, there were no waves after the war. And they went on, and, a lot of Alabamians, or not a lot, because a lot didn't go anyway, but some who were looking for an institution to go to had to go to someplace like that. But to answer your question more specifically, You did not have Republicans in charge of higher education. And so you got a lot of, here's a good word for us, continuity from, in fact, before the Civil War to after the Civil War. You got a lot of some of the professors who'd been there before the war. Their names were known, their reputations spoke for themselves, and they were respected. And so they weren't seen as opportunistic outsiders, and that made for smooth sailing. And then I say this too, in the defense of the Republican Party in Alabama and the Board of Regents who made these decisions about appointments. They were not trying to indoctrinate, in fact, the students, with Republican dogma or whatnot. What they were interested in was this, absolutely, especially at this time, a lot of Alabama's future political leaders, they, in fact, are trained at the University of Alabama. And if we have a core of, in fact, professors who are mired in the past and very much are unrepentant about the war and very much oppose change, then that can come over in the classroom. And that affects Alabama in the future because this is where Alabama's political leaders are oftentimes found. So it's not that the Republicans really want to, sell their message and force it down the throats of Alabamians. It was kind of insurance. And it's also this, we know how politics works. To the victor go the spoils. That's true now, that's true then. So we want to fix up some of our friends of our party with positions at the university, give them something called a salary, which is much appreciated during Reconstruction. Also, they get this, perks. Here's one perk, great, nice houses. They get residential houses there on campus. That didn't make up for what they had to go through, but they get houses. They get a $3,000 salary. There's no such thing as tenure, that's for sure. But anyway, so there's that dynamic at work too. To the victor go the spoils. We're going to appoint some of our team, some of our members of the GOP to these professorships, just that. And also, we don't want to see the Democrats controlling the mindset of the University of Alabama and in an existential kind of way, controlling how a lot of Alabama's future politicians think. Yeah.
You said that you hadn't found earlier accounts of this in academic work. Are there sort of historical fiction? Did you run across where some of these events are covered? And what was the role during that time of the federal troops who were attempting to enforce a Reconstruction policy and so forth against, what was their role against the Ku Klux Klan activity in the area at that time?
Yeah. Well, in terms of fiction, I don't know of any kind of fiction where, you have a book where characters are modeled on maybe Randolph and some of the professors. Now, there's one deceased professor, some of you may have heard of him. He wrote the book on the University of Alabama. His name is James Sellers. And James Sellers was a fine historian, but he wrote a book that covered, a big part of the university. And so he gave, the period that I looked at, very short shrift. He didn't spend much time with it. There was hardly anything. So it was kind of wide open and so forth. And then, you talk about, the federal troops and so forth. Well, United States troops were certainly in the South during Reconstruction, and they needed to be, because you had these forces who believed in white supremacy, and not only did they believe it, they enforced it in a very violent kind of a way. And, some of them would be what you and I would call today card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan, but most weren't. Most were individuals who, collectively might act with others, but they weren't, part of any clan. They didn't have regalia. There was no secret oaths. There was nothing like that, but they acted the same way. And when I say they acted the same way, this is how they acted. They struck under cover of darkness. They played for keeps. They were heartless. They maimed and they murdered. They burned and they lynched. And the federal troops, I won't even say minimize that, but they, for a while, kept these elements at bay, and you can say that. In Alabama, say down in some place like Henry County, Abbeville being the county seat, you hardly saw any Ku Klux Klan activity. Montgomery, oh wow, very bad. Tuscaloosa, very bad. It just kind of depended. Where the Republican Party was strong, you had agitation and trouble. Where it was weak, much less so, and all. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thanks. Yeah. But it was a lot of fun to work on this. And I'm working on now, and I'm lucky. I used to live over in Georgia. We did. And I'm really glad as an Alabamian to be back in this state for a number of reasons. And one reason, living in Auburn, I'm 1 hour away from the archives. And so can come down here and work. And I'm trying to put together a social history of Reconstruction and how the war changed Alabama forever. Yeah. So again, I really appreciate your presence. Thank you very much.
And thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Okay.
Thank y'all for coming. I hope to see y'all again next month for Caleb R. Jackson's talk on Benny Atkins. Thank y'all.